This is the story of women who broke into rooms they were never invited to, using nothing but a straight spine, a fork held correctly, and a voice trained to sound like money. Etiquette, the kind taught in finishing schools, the kind that sorted elegant ladies from outsiders, has always been sold as a beauty standard. But for a certain kind of woman throughout history, it was actually a set of lockpicks. And once you understand how the con worked, you'll never look at a finishing school the same way again. A village outside Bristol, England in 1817. A young woman shows up wearing a black turban, speaking a language nobody in town has ever heard before. She calls herself Princess Caraboo, says she was kidnapped from an island near Sumatra, and somehow English high society buys every word of it. Families take her in, feed her, dress her up, treat her like visiting royalty. Most versions of this story focus on the costume and the invented language, but that's not actually what sold it. It was how she carried herself. In Georgian and Victorian England, your posture told people who you were before you'd said a single word. She understood that instinctively, this cobbler's daughter named Mary Baker underneath all that turban and theatre. Decoding what Victorian-era posture actually symbolised wasn't some academic curiosity for her. It was the whole con. Skip ahead about 90 years and the stakes get a lot more expensive. Cassie Chadwick tells a Cleveland bank almost casually, like it's barely worth mentioning, that she happens to be the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. Not exactly a small claim, considering he was the richest man in the country at the time. She doesn't oversell it. She lets the bankers connect the dots themselves, and because she moves like old money and dresses like old money, and that distinction, old money versus new money, was everything in the Gilded Age. She never once acts like she needs anyone's approval, and they hand her millions in loans against a fortune that flat out doesn't exist. By 1904, when the whole thing finally caves in, conservative estimates put her take at a couple $1 million, though some historians think the real number went much higher, since plenty of embarrassed victims likely never came forward. Either way, nobody thought to double-check her, because who's going to interrogate a woman who clearly knows which fork to use? And that's really the other half of this. People treat table etiquette and manners like a memory test. Which fork, which glass, elbows off the table, the salad fork on the outside, fish fork next, bread plate always to the left. But before credit checks and background checks existed, a dinner was basically the background check. Anybody can lie about their last name. Almost nobody can fake 20 years of table training over the course of one meal. The women running these confidence tricks knew that better than anyone, so they didn't try to skip the work. They actually went and got trained. There's an old guide from the early 1900s, written for people trying to claw their way into New York's most exclusive circles through what we'd now call social climbing, and it flat out recommends hiring a private coach, someone like Miss D'Angelo Berg, who taught what people at the time called society intonation, plus how to walk into a drawing room, how to leave one, and how to fix your posture from the ground up. So the fastest route to fake breeding, it turns out, was to go get actually finished, to go through a finishing school, the same way a real debutante would. Beau Brummel had already proven a generation earlier that you could construct an entire social identity out of nothing but impeccable manners and a perfectly tied cravat. These women were running the same playbook. Now here's where this jumps forward into something you'd recognise, and it's got nothing to do with banks. Go back and read the mid-century etiquette manuals, the Emily Post and Amy Vanderbilt editions written for 1950s courtship. and look at what they'd actually be catching if you ran them against dating today. Those books worked like a verification system too. A man who knew exactly how to ask for a second date, who understood the specific steps of a formal introduction, was proving something real about where he came from, because you couldn't just look that knowledge up. It took years around the right people to pick it up naturally. That whole system is gone now. A dating profile can say anything it wants. Nobody's checking whether a person actually knows which side the bread plate sits on, and that gap, the space-old etiquette used to quietly police, is exactly where a lot of modern grifting has moved in. The most talked about case from the last decade involved Anna Delvey, Anna Sorokin, a woman who convinced hotel staff, financiers, and half of New York's social scene that she was a wealthy German heiress, running entirely on confidence and expensive taste as her only actual credentials, until she was convicted of theft and fraud. It's the story that inspired Netflix's Inventing Anna, and if you've watched that series, you've seen a dramatized version of how far that con actually stretched. Same trick as Chadwick, same trick as Caraboo, just running on Instagram instead of a bank ledger or a turban. So line them up: a fake princess in 1817, a fake heiress in 1904, a fake socialite in the 2010s. None of them needed real money to get real access. What they needed was to look like they belonged, and belonging was built the exact same way every single time. A straight spine, correct table manners, and a voice that never sounded like it was asking for permission. Elegant ladies' fashion and etiquette was never really about being a good person. It was about being unreadable as an outsider, and every one of these women worked out that you could build that illusion piece by piece, almost exactly like a real education, almost exactly like finishing school, minus the one detail where any of it was true. So the next time good posture and flawless table manners impress you, ask what they're actually proving. History keeps landing on the same answer: not character, just training. And training belongs to anyone patient enough to fake it well enough for long enough to walk through the door before somebody thinks to check. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe to Wealth Atelier, tap like, and send it to a friend who would get into the Anna Delvey comparison. It actually helps more than you'd think. If you want to see more videos on elegance, wealth, and etiquette, view our playlist, Elegant Ladies, Fashion and Etiquette. I'm glad you're here. See you in the next one.